Thank you. Hi, welcome everyone. It's great to see you here tonight who have braved the outdoors and the darkness. And welcome to everyone on Zoom. We can't see you here, but we know you're here. We're delighted to have you. And we're looking forward to seeing your questions in the chat when we get to Q&A. This is the 12th annual event of the Woodstock Film and Discussion Series. Since its founding in 2012, our focus has been on global problems and possible local solutions, as well as what each of us can do. Presented the last Monday of the month from January through April. The series is free and open to all ages, but donations are welcome and help to support our programs. The Film and Discussion Series is brought to you at this point by Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock New York Transition, and the Woodstock Jewish Congregation. Woodstock Land Conservancy is a nonprofit organization committed to the protection and preservation of the open lands, forests, water resources, scenic areas, and historic sites in Woodstock and the surrounding area. Woodstock Transition is part of the global transition town movement of communities. We engage locally to strengthen our community's resilience and create positive alternatives. And you're sitting in the Woodstock Jewish Congregation, which is dedicated to the advancement of Jewish ethics, culture, religion, and very much sustainability practices and saving the planet. The WJC strives to enable participants to enrich their lives and that of their communities through worship, celebration, study, and fellowship. Tonight's program, Building Our Future with Protection of Land, Biodiversity, and Wildlife Corridors in the Catskills and Hudson Valley, we'll begin with 3 videos which run for a total of 45 minutes. The first, a half-hour film called Fools and Dreamers, Regenerating a Native Forest, comes from Happen Films, a wonderful company that specializes in videos about sustainability, permaculture, natural building, and more. The video has won multiple awards, as has the next video, Rewilding the Northeast from the Northeast Wilderness Trust. The last video comes from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. It's called Conserving Nature in Your Community, Critical Environmental Areas, and it is very local. After the videos, Andy Mossey, Executive Director of the Woodstock Land Conservancy, will expand upon what we have already watched as he talks about the work of the Land Conservancy in our community and the challenges being faced in this era of climate change and pressure for overdevelopment. We will be passing, well, actually, they're out there on your seats or index cards for you to put your questions for Andy in the Q&A. And we ask those of you on Zoom to put your questions in the chat. Liz Harrington will then pass on all the questions to Andy so he is able to answer them. Again, thank you for coming.
There really just hasn't been a more urgent moment in human history to conserve as much land as possible, both sustainable forestry and wilderness.
We'll be right there, folks.
I think they basically thought we were naive greenies from the city. I'm sure they thought that we had come here with all these ideas and within a year or two we'd find it was all just too hard and it wasn't happening and we'd go again. Here we are 31 years later. And it's interesting because I don't think there's a single farmer around us who may not be completely believing what we're doing, but I don't think there's a single farmer who's not backing Hinawai now. I think it was in about October 1987, we wrote an article for the local newspaper, which is called the Akaroa Mail. I just thought we'd let the community know what we were doing here. It was interesting because we wrote this article and then a few weeks later we got this amazing response from one of the farmers I can read you that article if you like. So, well, it was a much longer article than this, but I said in the article, my secret dream is that one day a whole catchment from summit crest to sea, from snow tussock to nicol palm, from salmesia to mamaku tree fern and yellow-eyed penguins could be set aside for nature to reassert her original covering. That's what I said in the article. And then this was a response from one of the farmers. Again, I'm only reading the last 2 paragraphs. This is a farmer who lived in the next valley on a gorse-infested farm, which he had been trying to fight all his life. And he said, I am all for saving patches of bush, but the thought of starting from scratch on land that is clear enough to be used productively frankly appalls me. As for shutting up a whole valley, heaven help us from fools and dreamers. I love that. I regard that as a great compliment, because we need a few more fools and dreamers in the world, I think. So here we are on Hinawai Reserve. We're in the southeast corner of Banks Peninsula, which is on the east coast of the South Island, jutting out into the Pacific. The amazing thing about New Zealand, I think, is how recently people got here. Across the Tasman Sea, 60,000 years ago, when the Aboriginal people reached Australia, but only about 800 years ago, until amazing Polynesian voyagers finally hit the biggest landmass in Polynesia and settled here. The first named group we know of is called Waitaha. Another wave of settlement came called Ngāti Māmoe from the North Island. And then in about 1700, the Ngaitahu or Kaitahu came southwards from the North Island again. Then, of course, Pākehā came. Pākehā, the European settlers from the other side of the planet, they arrived here. All these waves of human settlement had a huge impact ecologically, as you can imagine. At the beginning, Banks Peninsula was forested from side to side and from top to bottom, an ancient old-growth forest. Both Māori and European settlement had a huge impact on the forest. So by 1900, less than 1% of the old-growth forest was left. So Hinawai Reserve, it's a result of the Morris White Native Forest Trust. We look after 1,500 hectares. It's quite a big area, several catchments. The whole idea was to make it possible for nature to speed up the regeneration of the native forest and restore the native biodiversity as much as is possible, because we've lost some things altogether. Conservation was our first goal, to restore the biodiversity on which we're all completely dependent. We sometimes forget that. Some people say, well, why are you restoring the forest? In a way, saying why are you doing it is like saying, why should you love your mother? That's what a sort of parallel. We're totally, totally dependent on vegetation and the wildlife it supports for our own lives. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for plants and vegetation and animals and birds and so on. So our prime goal is conservation, but from the very beginning we decided that people would be able to come here freely and whenever they wanted, without asking, could just come and walk our tracks. And there's many, many kilometres of walking tracks now. So it's really like a little mini national park, right on the doorstep of Akaroa itself. So there's 2 centres of settlement, if you like. The house we're in now is my post-earthquake house. Previously I lived in an older house just about 100 metres away across to the east, and that was somewhat damaged in the big earthquakes of 2010 and 2011. Andrew, who's been a trustee, came to work here with us several years ago, and he lives during the week in my old earthquake-damaged house and goes home to his wife Suzanne in the weekends. And then Otanarito Homestead, Paul and Tricia live down there, and it's about 1 hour's walk away.
The nest is on the power pole up there, and there's a few of them, but I can't work out how many.
This is Hinawai Stream, the first crossing. This is permanent flow here, even in the driest of drought years, we've never lost our flow in the larger streams. And it's amazing when you think of it, because a lot of people think of Banks Peninsula being a sort of an open, dry, grassy place, but this is really what Banks Peninsula is and was. And the water is a very prominent part of it. We just keep finding new waterfalls as we explore more. This is one of the first ones we found. It's right on the main track, so everybody sees this. We put a little 1-minute track off to it. It's called Fuchsia Falls. It's only one of about 47 waterfalls across the whole of Hawaii that we've found so far and named.
You can't meet Hugh and not just like him. Hugh's the boss and he's the day-to-day manager of the reserve. He gets up every day, he has the same routine and he goes to work. And work is hard. We don't use vehicles to get to work, so the work site might be 2 hours walk away. And so 2 hours after walking to work, you start work and you work all day and then you walk home for 2 hours. And when he gets home, he'll have his bath and have his dinner. And from about 7 o'clock or 7:30, he's ready for his evening. And so he sits at his table and he starts working. And he does all the paperwork involved with Hawaii. He writes letters, he writes submissions, he writes and he writes and he writes. And the next day he gets up and off he goes again. He's amazing. It's his life. It's his dream.
I better stop there and it gets too difficult. Ha! From a very, very early age, I was walking on Banks Peninsula. I remember getting very interested in bird life, and I thought, oh, I'll grow Banks Peninsula plants in the back garden of our family home. I just got so fascinated by the way plants grew. Just everything about plants just completely caught my fancy. It was interesting at university because I had decided from the very beginning to do both arts and science. And it was botany I went on with, really. So for several years I'd been tramping on a regular systematic grid pattern of sampling across Banks Peninsula, doing in much greater detail than had ever been done before, a detailed botanical look at the peninsula. And then as I was doing this, I was thinking, gosh, I thought it had been completely trashed, but there's so much still here, a lot of it coming back. So all this made me think, I'd love to look after a bit of this land and let this all happen. And amazingly, I was introduced to this guy called Morris White. He'd set up a fund to purchase land for conservation purposes on Banks Peninsula. He said, would you be interested in being involved? And I think I waited about half a nanosecond and said yes. We started looking for land, and I kept my eyes sharp open. And on this particular bit of land, which was the original part of Hinawai, 109 hectares, I said to Morris, look, this is ideal. It's a reasonable size, but not huge. It's got old growth forest on it, so we can see what the end result would be of a regeneration program. And it's basically uneconomic in marginal hill country, which really shouldn't really be farmed at all. September 1987, we bought that land. 4 years later, it became hugely bigger because we had the opportunity to buy Altanareto Station, which was right next to us, and that made it 10 times bigger. The local community was a bit suspicious about what we were doing, I have to say.
All the farmers in the area thought he was a total nutter.
When I first heard of the fact that Hugh and the Trust were going to use gorse to help regenerate the natives, I was a sceptic of it.
They went, no, he's going to let gorse grow. You can't let gorse grow. I come from a rural background. Gorse is a weed. You get rid of gorse. You burn it, you poison it, you bulldoze it, but you get rid of gorse.
Gorse is a terrible, terrible weed for pastoral farming. It's shocking. And no one, let alone me, would deny that. But it's also, almost nothing is black and white, is it? If you've got it and it's sort of infested the landscape irretrievably, in a way, it's worth looking at its good points and seeing, well, maybe we don't have to fight it. On this marginal hill country, fighting it usually makes it worse because that's what gorse thrives on. So we said, no, we're just going to leave the gorse alone on this gorse-infested pasture. We don't want pasture, we want native forest to regenerate, and gorse is a wonderful nurse canopy for native forest regeneration. It's an opportunistic plant. It takes advantage of cleared ground and forest climates, but it can't stand shade. It has to have full sunlight. So as soon as it's shaded, it's dead. So it grows quite fast in the full light, but then other things come in underneath it, naturally. Shade-tolerant hardwood trees, for example, and they just thrive under the gorse shelter. The gorse is a nitrogen fixer, so it's actually fertilising the soil all the time, with nitrates, a very important nutrient for plant life. This is old man gorse here with a few natives. Often it's thicker than this, sometimes it's thinner than this, but eventually all these natives come up under here. The one that's probably the most abundant one of all is mahoi or whitey wood, which we can see here. It thrives under the shade, but once it gets its head up, it loves the sun as well. So as soon as the head's up above into the light, it's shading the gorse, and the gorse dies. As all these lower parts of the gorse is all dead because it's shaded.
I initially thought that the progression from gorse to native trees would take 50 years, but in 10 years you could see it. You could see them coming up through the gorse in areas that I didn't realise there would be natives growing.
Now, of course, you're not getting pasture back, but you're getting native forest back with all its benefits. Increased benefits now with carbon sequestration, as well as all the ecological and biodiversity values that are being fostered this way. Our whole philosophy is what I call minimal interference management. People have an inflated opinion of what Homo sapiens is capable of. I hate to say this because I'm a Homo sapiens as well. But we're really good at damaging things. We're not all that good at putting things right. But all the serious work of natural regeneration of native forest and wildlife has been done by nature. People say to us, oh, you're planting all this forest back. And it's a sensible sounding question, but really if we were planting this forest back, we'd never do it on 1,500 hectares of land, of wild, hilly, rough terrain. We'd never do it. Nature has planted the forest back in totally ecologically appropriate and scientifically interesting ways. There's millions of hectares of productive farmland in New Zealand on good soils and on easy terrain. But then there's also, let's say, millions of hectares also in marginal hill country that are not actually that productive, but with our farming ethic, we sort of think it's cleared a forest, we should keep farming it and producing food. And of course we need to produce food. We all have to eat. So we're all dependent on the farms producing food. Perhaps we could be a bit more sensible, maybe eat a little bit less meat and make it more efficient and environmentally friendly. But my idea, even New Zealand-wide, and particularly with the possibility of income now from this land as carbon sequestration, you stop trying to farm that land. You don't even plant exotic forests on it. For timber maybe, but certainly not for carbon sequestration. That's just replacing one ridiculous folly with another ridiculous folly. The scene is wide open for taking this marginal gorse-infested hill country and letting it just do what Hinawai is doing on a much grander scale and regenerating into native forest on its own. We don't have to plant this stuff. Nature's doing it. All we've got to do is take away the deleterious things that are stopping it happening fast. As well as sequestering carbon, you get all the other benefits. You get the huge biodiversity on which we're totally dependent as well. And we also share the world with all the other species that have evolved as well. That's a crucial thing we tend to forget about. It's got to be reasonably deep because we don't want it too high up. Where do you want it? Yeah, in the middle.
Everything's done very slow here. People walk. Paul and I will use a vehicle, but Hugh doesn't use a vehicle. He'll cycle or he'll walk. So he doesn't believe we should be using fossil fuels, and instead of saying don't use fossil fuels, he just rides his bike. And he'll use public transport.
I'm a technological person like anyone in the modern world. I have a house with electricity. My hot water is heated by the sun, by solar panels on the roof, but I don't have photovoltaic cells to create electricity here, and we are on a national grid here. So that's quite a big technological thing. I have a landline telephone. I don't have a cell phone. It wouldn't be pointless anyway because we're out of cell phone range here, thank goodness, thank heavens. I'm not against all this technology. I'm not anti it, but I don't want it. I'm very happy with the level of technology I have here. I do see, unfortunately, that uncritical acceptance of a lot of this technology, we're losing a lot of our old skills and artistic and creative satisfaction. I really do feel that quite strongly. So I'm not in a sort of mood to just roll with the tide and take on all this technology, which I think is unnecessary for me and actually not all that good for the community, to be honest. It has wonderful advantages as well. And some of the things that technology produces, I'd be the first to praise. I mean, the bicycle, for example, I regard as the peak of transport technology. And it's technology, and I love it. I love my work here, and I meet innumerable people here. I'm not a hermit. I do interact with the rest of humanity, for sure. And love it. My roots are here. I immense satisfaction from seeing what is happening here. Fire has always been our biggest fear, I'd say. In 2011, we had a major lightning strike here. So that morning was terrible. We actually saw the thunderstorm come over. It was almost a rainless thunderstorm in July. It was the driest winter we've ever recorded. So the conditions were like summer-like dry conditions here. And then this electrical storm come over. We saw the lightning strike come down, and it hit Full Moon Bluff across here on the high ridge, and it just exploded into flame. We had an immediate response. It was, I think, 7 helicopters, and the helicopters could barely fly that first day because of the wind. So it largely just kept burning. Firefighters said, look, we just don't know what it's going to do overnight. So I packed up what I could. It was one of the worst moments of my life. And was evacuated to Akaroa, jumped on my bike and rode to Akaroa. In the morning I woke up there, looked up, and the whole of Taraterehu, Stony Bay Peak, was just ringed with fire. And by that time the wind had died down, and then the helicopters could fly, and they took monsoon bucket after monsoon bucket out of Putakitaki Pond. But the interesting thing was, every time it was burning fast through gorse, every time it hit a bush edge, a regenerated native bush edge, or even beech forest, older growth forest, just went out. So there was almost no native bush destroyed. Huge areas of gorse with natives coming through, but was still largely gorse, that was burning hot and fast. So it burned, I think, for 27 hours. But it was very emotional for me. I came back the next morning to my house, found it still here. Fire was out, but the whole landscape in front of me was just blackened. It was just a complete nightmare. Yeah. I can still feel that emotion just almost leaping on me like a panther.
I think the community now, by and large, is absolutely in support of Hanawai. We realised that the way farming was done over the years had to be changed, and I think from what Hugh has done has helped people realise that it can be done in a good way.
I think it's a really interesting time to be involved in conservation. There's this great groundswell now of people who are closing off whole gullies because it's uneconomical land, so they're letting the bush grow back, and they're fencing it off so that nature can be there, so that we can have these corridors, and so that the birds can move and the insects can move and things can get from the summit to the sea and over the hills to the next one.
Forestry alone won't save us from global warming, because a lot of the sequestered carbon is locked up in fossil fuels. But even covering every inch of dry land in the world with forests wouldn't sequester enough if we keep on burning the fossil fuels that have been sequestered for millions of years. So forestry is definitely part of the solution, but not the whole part. We have to change the way we use energy as well. In a big way, we have to do it very quickly, or we're really stuffed. No one person can solve these massive problems. So all you can do, and all the universe can expect of you, is to do your best. Your best can be on all sorts of different scales. We're doing our best here in terms of human life and the ecology and biodiversity and climate and other species sharing the planet with us, all those things.
Plant for the birds, plant for the bees. Throw a few flowers in your garden. It doesn't have to be as big as Hinawai.
So if people can look at Hinawai and say, gosh, this is succeeding in lovely ways, I'll do something in my own little corner of the world that draws some sort of inspiration from there, I'd be delighted with that. It's never been our intention. Our intention was just to do the right thing in this corner of the world. But if that's repeated over and over and over again, well, the possibilities are immense. The problems are immense, but the solutions are immense too.
There really just hasn't been a more urgent moment in human history to conserve as much land as possible, both sustainable forestry and wilderness. There has been an incredible amount of science that's come out in the last few years that point to the unparalleled value of wild forests to conserve biodiversity, to hold off extinction, and to store and sequester incredible amounts of carbon. We know that wilderness is an incredibly powerful natural climate solution, and we need to be conserving more of it. Northeast Wilderness Trust is a land trust based in Montpelier, Vermont, but we work all across New England and the state of New York. And we were founded in 2002 and have conserved 37,000 acres of land up to this point. All of the properties that Northeast Wilderness Trust protect are considered forever wild, which means from the moment we either acquire it or put an easement on it, there will no longer be logging, and the property will essentially be an old-growth forest of tomorrow.
We have to adjust our heads to move in forest time. I'm deeply envious of the people in 300 years who get to see the forests we protected today when they're all grown up. Because I mean, on the time scale of a tree, most of the forests in northern New England are like teenagers and barely get beyond that. When there is some potential future time down there where our properties have 300-year-old trees on it, that's going to be really cool. We are at the Bramhall Wilderness Preserve in Bridgewater Hollow, Vermont. We conserved this property in March of 2020. And so when I first came here and I met this property, I just had this really magical experience. I was walking through the woods and there was just a porcupine on a rock looking at me, and there were deer and there was moose rubs everywhere, and it was early spring, so there were all kinds of little amphibians in the vernal pools, and it was just super magical. And I think maybe I'm slightly biased, but that magic has just sort of permeated every visit since then. And it sort of grew as a place that became really important to me, and it became really important to me to finish this project. So some of the features of this place that make it important for wildlife are, one, there's really mature forest. There's a long history of human Westerners settling here and kind of clear cutting, taking down all the forests. And so almost everything we have here is second growth forest in the whole Northeast. Those forests have been used in a wide variety of ways ever since, for timber, for sugaring, for firewood extraction, stuff like that. And so as a result, sort of across the region, our forests are really lacking in that old forest structure, those big dead trees, those big down logs. And those are important for tons of things. Those are important for little tiny decomposers and slime molds, but they're also important for bears, which will hibernate in them for the winter, and coyotes will have their pups in them, and fishers will live in them and hunt in them. And so all the way from the large mammals to the tiny mammals to the slimy little organisms, that kind of structure is really important. And it's rare. It's really rare. And this place has a lot of it. And as a result, we really wanted to protect this as it is.
Babysitter Swamp has always impressed me as being unique, practically from the first time I saw it over 45 years ago, because it's the only place along this wetland complex that has old trees. And as a wildlife ecologist, I began to recognize that there were things going on that property that were different than the other properties. It's the upper tooth that inserts into and stops and anchors, and then it's the drag of the lower jaw that actually makes the bite.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? Here, you come feel this. Babysitter Swamp is a name that I gave this property because when I first started coming here, my research quickly helped me appreciate that it was being used by mother bears and their infants. Basically what happens is the mothers bring their little ones to these huge old trees, and the cubs climb the trees to get out of harm's way while she feeds in the adjoining wetland. And there's a green up, as we call it, of sedges and forbs that happen there in late April and May when she's using this place, that are really important food for her. What seems odd is that this place gets used every year, and yet bears only have offspring every other year. So what's going on? A given mother bear will use the trees every other year, but it's her daughters that use the trees in the alternate years. And that's what my research revealed. And as a tracker and professional naturalist, I know that the trees are getting used every year because of the scent marking sign that I find. The hairs on the trees, the claw marks, the bites. From the beginning, I wanted to conserve my property with Northeast Wilderness Trust. It was both incredibly wonderful and logical that I do that. There isn't a day that goes by that I'm not just immensely grateful for that opportunity, because here in the East, where so much of our land is privately owned, we're really lucky to have this organization helping us do this important work.
So something can feel wild or have a wild character, but unless it's protected, there's no guarantee it will stay that way.
I've seen too many wonderful places get trashed. I've spent a lot of time in some of the wildest habitat in North America. And the thing that causes me great pain is the realization that again and again, no matter where I am, from the Ongava Peninsula in northern Quebec all the way across to the Arctic National Refuge, you know, with 11 different caribou herds, for example, that I've studied, none of it's safe. Very little of it is put aside as wilderness. I think each and every one of us really needs to get on this and work with organizations like Northeast Wilderness Trust to put these wonderful lands aside forever. And large and small alike. I don't care if you want to conserve 20 acres or 200 acres or 2,000 acres. It's all important.
The biggest threat to wilderness is not what's actually happening to wilderness that exists, but it's the lack of wilderness areas in New England. Out of all of the incredible conservation that's happened across the region, which at this point is upwards of 25% of New England has been conserved in some way, only about 1 to 3% of all of that is forever wild. It's a radical act of humility to put a piece of land into a designation that means humans permanently will not do anything with it. Western civilization has dictated that forests are there for our benefit. Our civilization has been built on the backbone of these forest resources. Wilderness conservation flips that entire thing on its head. And it's about setting these places aside permanently for their benefit, not for ours.
At a local level, Woodstock is really modeling a planning approach for the future that's not only going to help people through tourism and the economy, it's not only going to help wildlife by having intact habitat, but it's also going to help the community be resilient to climate change. This is beautiful. We're going to be meeting with John Adams, who is a resident of Woodstock, and he's a farmer. When did you recognize that this area was so important?
Well, we see a lot of wildlife. Turkeys, black bear, deer, of course. This is an important area as a wildlife corridor between the Catskills and the Shawangums.
There are certain species of wildlife that really rely on connections in the land to move about. So we're trying to prevent development from severing connections in nature.
This used to be a dairy farm, which was run by the New York State Department of Corrections. And the farm, which has not been in use for 10 years now, makes a beautiful land bridge between Minnewaska State Park and the Vinoykill State Forest and the Catskill Park beyond it.
A critical environmental area, or a CEA, is a designation that a local agency can put on land of unique or exceptional value.
I grew up on a farm on the other side of the ridge. The lay of the land is very similar, and I think deep inside, that's what really touched me.
What is required to establish a CEA is for a community to first know what it prioritizes. They need to document why it's important and map the area.
We discussed the designation of 2 critical environmental areas in the town. It's relatively easy, but you need to take an inventory and see what you have and do an open space plan, and you have to get it approved by the town board, and it has to have a public hearing, then it gets approved. The area is critical because it could be an area to buffer the effects of climate change.
It's a beautiful area, and I think we're really on the right page.
Cedar Swamp is about 8,000 acres. It's actually one of the largest complexes of its kind in the Catskill region.
Oh, wow. It's exciting that the town is acknowledging that by including it in the open space plan and also adding this critical environmental area designation.
It will help prevent flooding because the wetlands will absorb some water during heavy rains. And it will also help with the water supply because it will hold some water during dry seasons, and which will continue to perk into the ground. I mean, the last few summers have been very rainy, which I think there's been a lot of flooding, a lot more flooding than I remember. They all got the message that the environment is important.
Yeah.
Without clean water, there's no sense being here.
I think the locals always recognized that the natural beauty of the area was important, not only for environmental reasons, but for economic reasons as well.
Colony Farm is right in the middle, which could be a potential economic resource if we can open it up to the public and get in some agritourism. This town board, I know it's bipartisan. I think everyone's on the same page because they've recognized what they have and they don't want to lose it.
We find that some communities are taking action because they've enrolled in the Climate Smart Communities program. In this case, Woodstock already was taking these kinds of steps. So we're actually exploring with them the idea of maybe they could take the Climate Smart Community Pledge. That'll increase their opportunity to get funding, to get technical assistance, and to even become more resilient.
We're talking about becoming a climate smart community, so I'm hoping we can continue to work in that direction.
Motion? Move it. Second, so roll call vote. So Mr. Bradley? Aye. PJ? Aye. Roger? Aye. I vote aye.
I would love to see all of the communities in the Hudson Valley taking similar approaches to what Woodstock has done, all contributing to a valley that has large forests still here, has huge wetland complexes, has streams that are able to flow freely. I mean, it's irreplaceable. It's irreplaceable. It is.
Climate Smart Communities is a certification program that provides guidance and funding support for local municipalities. Conserving natural habitats is just one action that communities can take to adapt to climate change.
Testing, 1, 2. So for those of you in the room, there are some pieces of paper, index cards on your seats. Gail's coming around, and then Kirk also has some pens for you if you'd like to write any questions as we go along. Did anyone else have like a natural affinity to Hugh in the first film? I mean, I just want to sit down and have a cup of tea with him or something. He's probably has some pretty wild stories. So as we delve into this next portion of the program, where I'm going to talk about things a little bit local, I should probably introduce myself first and say hi to those of you who don't know me yet. My name is Andy Mossey. I started as the executive director at the Land Conservancy a little over 2 years ago now at this point. Time just flies. Pretty sure my predecessor, Max Resnick, is on the Zoom actually, so shout out to Max and all the other fantastic folks who have been involved with the Land Conservancy over the years. In our mission statement, one of the very first things and one of the very first words in our mission statement is that we're a community-driven organization. And it's huge thanks to all of you who are out here tonight for making our work possible. So thanks for being here, for caring, and for hopefully seeing some of this more thoughtful work into old growth forest that Northeast Land Trust was talking about in the second film possible, because the land that the Land Conservancy has been protecting now since 1988 ideally will be old growth forest one year. So hopefully we'll get there, but it takes effort, it takes time. All right, so I'm going to be talking about a few things. Can you hit the next slide for me, Karen, when you have a chance? I'm going to be talking about a few things in broad topics, and then we'll narrow down on some pretty specific projects that are happening here locally. And one thing as we start talking about forest health, which we'll talk about in just a moment, are just some individual acquisitions that we have been working on the past couple of years, and some things that we, at least one that we really hope to close on in the coming year in 2024. Just some stuff that we're really excited about. So our basic outline for this next part of the program is as follows. We're going to talk a little bit about forest health, talk about some habitat and wildlife, water and its essential role. Then we'll talk about some of the scary things like overdevelopment, things that get us really fired up. And then hopefully look towards a more balanced way to manage all these things. So as we all know, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but the forest and the forest around us, as we protect it, is really a complex web of energy and nutrients. And in the next slide, I call it the World Wide Web, but it's really just like how our natural environment communicates. And mycelium here, and the reason why that's on the slide is that is a fungus that connects trees to one another under the ground. And you may have heard a really fantastic Radiolab podcast about it. And if you haven't, look it up because it's very, very good. But mycelium is essentially a fungus in the ground that initially forms from decaying matter. That mycelium creates energy pathways between living organisms such as trees and shrubs. And that mycelium creates these individual pathways from all those trees. And as a tree does fall down or breaks down, it can actually transfer some of its nutrients to other more living and thriving trees. So it keeps the energy within its local system. A really healthy forest is quite biodiverse. And as we know, there are certain threats to this, including invasive species, development, clear cutting, and so on. Oh, let's go back one. But we can protect these lands. And when we protect these lands, it allows for more biodiversity to take place, such as what we saw Hugh doing in his stewardship work in New Zealand. And all of these, when they're working together, help to create air filtration and water filtration. Okay, you can hit the next slide. This is a really wonderful photo that WLC board member Hank Starr took just last week, actually, at Kenneth Wilson State Park. That is an excellent action shot of a beaver grabbing what we believe to be a sunny, which is just a type of fish. Oh, an otter. Oh yeah, you're right. Otter. Look at that. Nice long tail. Thank you. Well, it's a good catch. In addition to habitat, when we set aside lands, it creates these wildlife corridors between large areas. And when we get to some maps in just a moment, you'll see where we have protected areas and when we don't. And when we do have those protected areas, it does allow for not only wildlife such as our otter here and fish, but pollinators as well. Okay, next slide. And water. As we protect forests and natural lands, it does allow for natural filtration of surface water, which leads to groundwater. And the primary difference between the two, as many of you may know, surface water, rivers, streams, some of those vernal pools, groundwater is essentially all of that water that is then filtered down into our aquifer system and can lead to our drinking water supply. This year and the past couple of years, we've gone through huge waves of both excess water and then drought. Natural effects of climate change, unfortunately, but those severe weather patterns that we're starting to see shift in is because we have done quite a lot of damage to our natural environment. And when we have that type of damage, it becomes a lot less predictable with our weather events. And so having areas, strategic areas of where land is protected can be helpful for our residents as well. Okay, let's hit the next slide. All right. So this slide is a shout out to the town and our comprehensive plan. And what you'll see here is a few areas where actually quite large areas are protected in the Catskills. We're very fortunate to be surrounded by the Catskill Park Forest Preserve. So Overlook Mountain and this whole area, wild forest and wilderness areas. Mount Tobias over here, Tremper Mountain. And then down over this way, we have more Catskill Forest, which is bluestone wild forest here. And something that doesn't quite pop up here are the, is over in this area, we have our Xena Development LLC, of course. So we have large areas of protected land and a lot of private property, but between them are these corridors. And especially when we get to the west, we see that we have very large areas of contiguous habitat. As we go further east, more people, more private property, and it starts to fragment pretty drastically. Okay, let's hit the next slide. And as you all know, we have a project that Woodstock Land Conservancy has been working very closely on and advocating in opposition over the past several months, 6 months or so, since August of last year. And that was Woodstock National LLC, which is now known as Xena Development LLC. The plan that you see on the left is the entirety of their development plan or the parcels that they had purchased, which was 624 acres, which, as you can see, their original plan had the 18-hole golf course and a bunch of units of housing. But if we ignore that for just a moment and we look at this photo here, which was a screen grab by Kevin Smith, board chair at the Land Conservancy, you can see it's just wild forest, essentially. It's relatively untouched. And in the second film about the Northeast Land Trust, they mentioned clear cutting in the Northeast. And that's true. And specifically in this area in the Catskills, much of our land was actually clear cut twice. And there are some areas where we do have some old growth trees, but they're very and hard to reach areas. And Michael Kudish, who's a wonderful scientist based in the Catskills, has done excellent work logging where they are, and not actually logging, but writing down and tracking. Thank you. We gotta have some humor in here too. But regardless, all the flat areas were either bluestone quarried or logged for timber. And now we're all starting to grow back, and we have basically our teenage trees. This area down over here is actually bluestone wild forest, so that is protected. Okay, so the question is, can I explain what the roads are? And the roads are a little tricky to see here, but this road on this map is Sawkill. So that's Sawkill Road. And Sawkill Road on this map is right here. It goes up this way. Okay. The Kingston water supply lands, or watershed lands, excuse me, are right here. That's what this little blue section is. Oh, wow. Getting tacky. Nice. So that's what this is the Kingston Reservoir system. And it's directly adjacent to the Kingston Reservoir, city of Kingston. So again, Sawkill Road goes on up through here, and then Xena Highwoods Road heads up this way. Not down that way. This is actually Eastwoods Drive. So Xena Highwoods goes up like this. And then this land up here, it says Chayback on here, but this is now Woodstock Land Conservancy's Israel Whitman Preserve. Yeah, that's right. Actually, and more. So this little red parcel that's up here is also Israel Whitman Preserve. All right. Can we get the wide version of this, please? And let's hit the next slide. So in the last film, we learned a little bit about CEAs. And for those of you who are involved with the Xena Highwoods CEA, you'll remember that is quite a long process first. And the second is that a lot of work needs to be put into making a CEA happen. But when it comes down to it, what's most essential is that you have a good natural resources inventory to understand what is on site in order to make sure that you're saving lands that have critical biodiversity. In this area where Xena Development is, Xena Development LLC, we know that we have quite a lot of biodiversity here and a very strong natural resource area. This is a drone image from directly above the property, looking west towards the Catskills. So Overlook Mountain, this is the pond here. And it's kind of hard to see on this TV, so I apologize. But this outline within this wonderful map that Judy Kerman put together, you can, yeah, just hold it there for 1 second. The pond is right here in this image. So give you a little bit of a frame of reference. And if we look at some of the natural resources that are in here, we see quite a healthy water system as we're going through. All of these big blue splotches are not ponds or lakes, those are wetlands. And then the individual ponds themselves are much smaller, harder to see. Those are like the long fingers of blues. But we have quite a lot of wetlands, and we have a lot of areas that are buffer zones or riparian areas along those corridors. And all of those are very essential to protect. So the CEA has identified all that area, and you can see the orange throughout it is all part of the CEA parcels. Okay, let's hit the next slide, please. And we've been talking about contiguous lands and the importance of contiguous lands, and the greater image that we're looking at here, this more zoomed out image, includes parts of the Ashokan Reservoir, as you see on the left side. We talked about Bluestone Wild Forest quite a bit, but Bluestone Wild Forest heads east quite a ways as well. And then the idea, in theory, is to create a north to south corridor with Bluestone Wild Forest. So this is one of the reasons why the Land Conservancy has had its eye on this one parcel in particular, which we always call the Walrus property because that was the previous name of the last owner. Now Xena Development owns it, and should it be protected, then it does create an excellent north to south wildlife habitat corridor. It is, yeah, the orange that you see here. And then again, this is the dark green up here, and that's all Israel Whitman Preserve. And this is Kingston Reservoir System. And a lot of people don't realize this, but there are actually quite a few isolated Bluestone Wild Forest parcels on the north side of Sawkill Road, which goes this way. Gail was just asking about Ruby Rod and Gun Club, which is essentially a sportsman's club, and they own quite a lot of land, and they actually own all of this land, essentially wrapping like a backwards L around the Walrus property or Xena Development property. And even though they are hunting on their land, they do protect that land. They don't develop it, and they have that as essential habitat because that's in line with their goals and their mission. All right, let's hit the next slide. So how do we create some balance? Something that we don't talk about very much at the Conservancy is all of our advocacy work that isn't right in our backyard immediately. Something that I'm very involved with and have been very involved with in my professional life since moving back to New York is working at the state level and advocating in the DEC and in the governor's office and in other areas and buildings in Albany, including the legislative office building, to talk to our legislators about initiatives that we can take as a community and as a state that help to further a lot of the goals that we're talking about. Because it's really important that we're protecting lands right in our own backyard, but policy also needs to match some of that, especially at the state level. And we are very fortunate to live in New York, where wilderness was first written into our state constitution before any other state. And the Adirondacks still are the largest area of state protected lands in the country, which is fantastic. 30 by 30 is short term for meaning 30% of lands protected by the year 2030. And that has to do with land protection and climate protection and habitat protection. The idea is that if we can protect 30% of all area on our little globe here, then we will, at the very least, protect enough habitat and enough lands to stave off some of the most drastic effects of climate change. There's still a lot more to do, but it is a major initiative that if we can create these benchmarks, then we're taking really significant gains towards protecting it. And something that we're working on right now is speeding up our land acquisition process at the state level in order to see these come to fruition here in New York. There's a big backlog right now, unfortunately. So we're working with many other organizations and partners in the state of New York to help streamline this and make sure that there is funding available for larger acquisitions, such as those initial 600 acres we were talking about just a little while ago. So we talked about local issues, and then land trust we hit on just a little bit, but land trust in your backyard, easily one of the best ways to get towards that 30 by 30 benchmark. We're constantly going through acquisitions. In fact, that we've talked about Israel Whitman Preserve quite a few times at this point, and we do hope to grow Israel Whitman Preserve in this year. And so we're working towards an acquisition right now and have been over the past year and a half or so. And we hope that that will add essentially another third in acreage to the preserve itself, which includes a water body and essential habitat. And then I mentioned pollinator pathways. Probably don't need to get into too much detail here, as I'm sure you all are very familiar with the Woodstock pollinator pathway movement. All right. And then I'll leave you with this last image, which was a really special moment. The last two images were from Carla Rhodes. And Carla Rhodes lives within the community as a fantastic photographer and conservationist. Also ventriloquist, funny enough. And she's a really wonderful human being to hang out with. And we took a walk over at Israel Whitman Preserve at the end of the summer. It was September, actually. And so we were walking through Israel Whitman Preserve, just kind of talking about the negative effects of xenodevelopment and how that would carve out major amounts of habitat. But as we were walking through Israel Whitman, we just had all this wonderful experience just being really in the thick of it. You know, I kind of felt like Hugh that day, where we're just like poking at all the things and enjoying just being out there and breathing in the fresh air. And we're walking along this one trail, and all of a sudden I hear a scream, really loud scream. And Carla just drops to the ground and is like, "I've been looking for this everywhere." I said, "What? Those? Like, what is that?" And she then goes on to explain to me that this is hairy pine sap. It's not quite a fungi in the way that a mushroom is, but it is from decaying matter, but is living on it onto itself. And it's incredibly rare and is in fact not necessarily listed as endangered, but it's very, very rare. And to the point where our colleagues at Hudsonia had only seen it once before in their many years of working in this area. So we just happened to stumble across it while we were out there. Hairy pine sap. Did you find it on there? Nice. Dutchman's pipe. Yeah, for frame of reference, this is about 1 foot tall. It's about 10 inches tall. And when it starts up, it almost looks like fiddleheads from ferns, you know, as it comes up, it starts to unfurl. And then once it does unfurl all the way and opens up, then it releases spores and then it just comes back down. And that's it. Any questions?
So I have a couple here and I can collect.
All right, we have some questions rolling in. We have a few from Zoom. I'll start going through. The first question is Woodstock following Warsing's lead? And the answer to that is we do have a CEA, a critical environmental area, Xena Highwoods critical environmental area. It was on one of the slides that I had pointed to earlier. And we also have another one actually, little known, but we do have one on Yankeetown Pond as well. And we are also a climate smart community. Yeah, exactly. Okay, and we have another question that is there a way to create affordable housing in harmony with land, with protecting land? I'm assuming this person means. And it's easier said than done, man. It's quite a controversial issue and topic at the moment, especially. Thank you. Okay, excellent. But there are ways to do it, certainly, and it comes down to the planning process. It's widely considered by many conservationists across the country that if we think about the long term with protecting contiguous large areas of land and can set those aside, that's going to be best for not only forest health, but habitat and water. And if we focus development into very specific areas, that's actually better for the environment. Another one, do you have an opinion on any concerns over downed wood that can contribute to forest fires? And a subnote that says they seem to be leaving it on the ground in New England. And we do the same thing here in the Catskills. We leave dead and downed wood and downed trees and so on in the forest. And there is one way of thinking that is that we should be cleaning it up or clearing it and so on, except it really does provide essential habitat. And they touched on that a little bit with dens for bears and things, but they didn't necessarily talk about adding nutrients to soils and so on as it breaks down and adds additional fungi into the ecosystem. It's really essential to the environment. There is a fear around forest fires, and we've had this natural fear. However, what we've seen is, especially in specific areas and ecosystems, when we do have controlled fires and controlled burns, it's actually incredibly helpful for that ecosystem to regenerate and grow. And many of our native species, even here in the Catskills, are quite resilient to wildfires, even though we don't necessarily have them very often, fortunately. Is Forever Wild a legal definition? How does it take place? And what's 30 by 30 again? All good, all very good questions. Forever Wild can be a legal term, not necessarily. It depends on how it's written into either law or who is protecting the land. For example, any land that the Land Conservancy owns is technically forever wild because it's our primary mission to protect land forever. Your local land trust, whether it's Woodstock Land Conservancy or someone else who owns that land, their primary mission is to see the protection of that land in perpetuity for generations and generations. It's actually quite a big ask for a small land trust to take on. It creates a lot of pressure, and we have to think about, well, what can we do now to help create that lasting change for generations? So it can be a legal definition, but it depends on where it's written. If it's written into Constitution, for instance, like New York State Constitution, then yes. But if it's someone talking about their backyard and it's not a conservation easement, for instance, then no. And 30 by 30 is protecting 30% of lands by the year 2030. And also water. It is, but not every country has recognized the importance of 30 by 30. Why weren't the Catskills included on the New England and National Park map of forever wildlands? And I believe this person is referring to the map that was up on the second film, and it actually was. And you could see a very clear delineation of where the Catskills were. Whenever we talk about the Catskills or the Adirondacks, we have something called the blue line, which is basically a line drawn on a map. And as we know, within those forest preserves, it's a amalgamation of public and private lands. So that line is really what designates it. Here in the Catskills, we have about 1 million acres of protected lands by DEC. And in the Adirondacks, we have about 6 million acres protected. The Walrus Woodstock National Xena development property is often referred to as a keystone property. Can you briefly explain what that means and why it's important? If we were to look at a picture or a map of the Catskills, it's essentially like a little bit of a squished lima bean. And on the eastern portion of the lima bean is a gateway into the Catskills. That gateway into the Catskills is the Walrus property. It is Bluestone Wild Forest. It is a Walrus property in that contiguous north to south area of lands that I was describing before is smack dab in the middle. So when we refer to it as a keystone property, that's exactly what we mean. It is the most eastern portion of the entire Catskills. It's actually, if you do look at a map of the Catskills, it's a little notch out. It's a very small nose sticking out, and it's some of the largest unprotected lands in that area. Old growth forests are one thing, so is sustainable agriculture. Why? Which is the plan for Xena Cornfield? Xena Cornfield was originally, and there are probably some people here who were involved in the original protection of that land. And so I'm happy to hear from you all. But it's my understanding that the original reason why Xena Cornfield was protected was to avoid development of a scenic viewshed as well as a habitat. Agriculture is incredibly important and can actually have climate benefits to it as well. However, where it is now and the way that it's being managed now is just as a viewshed that will be clear of major trees. However, native grasses, as well as other native plants, provide a lot of habitat. And so it's now more of a pollinator forest area or pollinator grassland area. So that's the plan, is to keep it more pollinator centric, still open and viewshed and free for people to walk and recreate. Is the land WLC protects permanently protected? Yes, in short. As long as we exist as an organization, then yes, it will be protected. And we're not going anywhere. Can you say more about why a CEA designation is protective? In and of itself, CEAs are not legally binding protected areas. They are really an educational tool. They draw attention to areas of environmental significance, but they don't necessarily protect land. It's up to individual landowners as well as organizations to help see those areas be protected. Did that answer the question? If someone, okay. Oh, thanks. Fools and dreamers.
It's not the native plant or not the native plant.
My question, what goes native to New Zealand? I know goes from Scotland.
Oh, no way.
It is not native. He states that in the movie. It's not native. It's invasive. Yeah. It's also very, what makes it invasive is that it grows very rapidly. It takes over land that is
Was manipulated, essentially.
Okay. And then as you point out, it becomes not able to thrive into the shape. So it's a great starting plant in that regard for natural habitat, but then when the larger plants grow, then it dies down.
Thanks, Kirk. So for those on Zoom, just for everyone's benefit, the question was about gorse. Is it native or not native? And yes, in the film, Hugh responds saying that gorse is not native and does take over vast areas of hillside. But turns out that there's a benefit to it as well, which is pretty cool to see in that film. finding the silver linings. What is the status of Ontario Lake in Bluestone Forest? Ontario Lake specifically, there's a few things going on in Ontario Lake, and there's probably some people on Zoom that do have some updates on that. But there were some good ecological studies that happened last summer, specifically around milfoil and some other invasives that are proliferating within the water body itself. And those are quite interesting. The DEC has released some studies on that. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I could probably get you the studies from last year. And as you all may know, there is an adjacent 850 Route 28, which is the concrete manufacturing facility. And they still exist. However, you may remember, what was it, last year now? Or it was in 2022, 2 years ago. Wow. 2022, where Woodstock Land Conservancy, along with Catskill Mountain Keeper, actually filed an Article 78, which was against 850 Route 28 and the town of Kingston's ZBA, essentially saying that there was an inappropriate ruling. That seems to have kept things relatively quiet for at least for the time being, and they have not put forward, 850 Route 28 has not put forward any official applications for any further work there at this time. The trees around my house are really tall. Are they in danger? Are they healthy? A lot of lichen, maybe. I think that means lichen. Yeah, lichen. It depends without looking at it. You know, if they're very tall, then that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It just depends on what the other stressors are. If there's other trees around them as well to help create wind buffers. A lot of times what we have a problem with is even previous landowners before we own land or whatever the case may be, people will clear out quite a lot of trees and they'll leave one or two. And the problem with leaving one or two is then a big wind comes along and then just knocks it over. So our trees really like to have friends. So as long as they have some friends around, it should be okay. But if you're concerned, Woodstock Land Conservancy, but also Catskill Forest Association does great work with managing the forest. What's the best way to help fight xenodevelopment? Please check us out online if you haven't already. There is a form to volunteer, also to be in the loop of things that are going on. Right now is a bit of a quiet time in terms of what's happening with xenodevelopment. And so you haven't heard much because there's not much going on, but we expect things to move forward. So we will be putting more information out and also be announcing more events and things with how you can get involved if you're interested. I've heard that really to generate an old growth forest, you have to do something about the deer population since the deer eat all of the understory and the new trees coming up. Can you speak to this? Yeah, this is a good question. And deer, we have a very healthy deer population here in the Catskills. It's unbelievable how healthy they are. And it's both a blessing and a curse because it's wonderful to have fantastic habitat going around, but unfortunately we don't have any natural predators to deer. And when we don't have natural predators to an abundant species, then we get over culling of things like the understory of our forests. So there are ways to actually manage your forest that can create prime habitat and allow for the understory to grow. And a really interesting way of doing that is creating essentially what's called fringe forest or, well, we'll go with that term for now. So essentially what that is you actually identify specific trees to fell, and then you leave those trees as they've fallen over cross-marked and hatched in specific ways to create physical barriers. And then it allows for more understory to grow up between there. So if you do have something like a white pine stand, white pine was not originally endemic to this area. So you could cut those trees, let them fall, and then allow for more native species to grow up. Unfortunately, hunters do get a bad rap. But hunters actually create quite a big, they do help quite a lot with forest health. And they also contribute a huge amount to stewardship initiatives all across the country and the world. There's evidence to show that hunters have helped to protect vast amounts of land and have helped to create very healthy ecosystems when they get involved. So that's pretty interesting. All right, lots of invasives. Oriental bittersweet and thorn preserve. Is there a plan? How can we help? Something that's a bit of a misconception is the Land Conservancy does not own thorn preserve. Catskill Center does manage thorn preserve. However, I do know that they are addressing many of the invasive species within there, including mile a minute, as well as Oriental bittersweet. And it's helped by the fact that they have a wonderful program called CRISP, which is a Catskill Regional Invasive Species Prism. And if you're would like to get involved with CRISP specifically, you can find them online, or I can put you in touch with them as well. We are doing some of our own invasive species management, specifically around barberry and some other pests. So if you'd like to volunteer or help out with any of those, we would love to have you. And I'll put you in contact with Melissa. Invasion of barberry. I mean, that was a pretty good segue. All right. Anything else? Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. Really appreciate your time.
Great questions online.